Hello, welcome back to the Good Life Podcast. I am Matt Carpenter. It has been quite a while since we've recorded one of these, so thank you for listening again. And today, to get us started again, we have Susannah Roberts. She is an editor for Plough Quarterly for Mere Orthodoxy. She's edited other various online and print journals, and she is married also to a friend of the Good Life Podcast. We've had him on before, Alistair Roberts. So, Susannah, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for asking me.
So, I had the privilege of, just for background for listeners, I remember the first place I ever came across your work was your blog, Radio Free Thulkandra. And that was, for anyone that doesn't know, that's a play on C.S. Lewis's Ransom trilogy, not Space trilogy anymore.
I'm not sure what we're supposed to call it these days.
Yes. But people have very particular opinions on that. So, so I read there, and then I had the privilege of meeting her when she spoke at the Front Porch Republic conference in 2019. I think, in the fall.
That sounds right.
In Louisville.
Yeah.
Yep. And just hearing over time, your background is fascinating to me. So just, tell us a little bit about yourself. You grew up in New York City. So, talk about your growing up years, what it was like to live in the city, and wherever you want to go from there.
Sure. I'm a fourth generation New Yorker. I grew up on the Upper West Side, and Alistair and I now live on the Upper West Side when we're not in the UK, which we are right now. And it was, I'm half Jewish. My dad's ethnically Jewish. I was not brought up religiously, particularly, like we did Christmas and Hanukkah, and my grandfather actually was an ordained UCC minister, Congregationalist minister, but it was a very kind of like, there was not a lot of talk about Jesus, or any. But growing up in New York was wonderful. I couldn't, I'd love to, I would not, I wouldn't know how to raise a kid anywhere else. And it was just sort of, I had a great time. And then I went to Amherst College for undergrad, and then for graduate school, I went to Boston University. But somewhere along the line, I did convert, which was dramatic and interesting, and kind of had a couple of different stages. But yeah, it was very secular upbringing, very, my dad and I used to have these long, elaborate theological, philosophical conversations. I talked, everyone was very, it was not a closed down kind of secularism. It was just it was a kind of, I don't know, there just seemed to be a lot of questions rather than dogmatic atheist answers. I'd say I was not raised as a hardcore atheist. I was raised just not as a Christian.
So kind of, if you could say, the best of old school atheistic liberalism, the type of liberalism that is actually open to discussion.
Yeah, although I would say agnostic rather than atheistic, because again, there wasn't a teaching that there was no God. It was just we don't know what there is. My dad's parents were actually Communist Party members, and so they were kind of more determinedly atheist. They were Trotskyists, so they were not Stalinists, which is kind of they were the nice version of communists, so to speak.
Right.
And I did, when I was about 12, I asked my parents if I could go to Sunday school, and they were like, well, what can we do? The best they could do was we all joined a Unitarian Universalist church on Lexington Avenue and 80th Street called All Souls. And they were like, all right, this is as far as we can go with this. And I went to Unitarian Sunday school for like 2 years maybe. And my grandfather, who was, an ordained Christian minister, however sort of theologically liberal he was, thought that this was hilarious and made enormous fun of us and used to call it Our Lady of Comparative Literature. And then this one time the Sunday school group they took us to Godspell, like an off-Broadway production of Godspell, which, if you guys don't know, is a very sort of hippie 1970s coded. So this was a revival, sort of musical telling of the life of Christ, and it's quite faithful. And there's the Act 1 finale is the institution of the Eucharist. And I remember like watching it, and I had enough, obviously about Christianity. Like I had cultural literacy. I knew what sort of, I'd read parts of the Bible. What Christianity is. And so when I realized, okay, they're doing the institution of the Eucharist here, I was like, wow, we don't do that at Unitarian services. I think this is a different religion. So that was fun. But eventually I did convert, and I can tell you about that if you'd like.
Oh, yes, I would love to hear about how you came to faith. I mean, so it's already started, C.S. Lewis had his initial moments that he talks about where he would see, he would be pierced by these desires of joy that he could not explain. It sounds like you had glimpses of something along those lines where the Holy Spirit began just the initial preparation. So. Yeah,
I mean, well, so my dad had read me the Narnias when I was little, and then when I was like, I don't know, 13 or so, or 14, and I started to have miscellaneous like existential crises, like why is it that we do, why do we get up in the morning, why do we take action, like what is it that we're supposed to be aiming at, what is there? He gave me a bunch of the apologetics, and I started with Surprised by Joy, Lewis's autobiography, and when I read it, I was like, oh, I didn't know anyone else felt like that. So I totally, like that, his description of joy was something that I had had my whole life. Like, I'd had those experiences my whole life. And it was so on point, and it was so precisely what I had experienced that it was kind of astonishing. And then I read, Mere Christianity and Miracles and Problem of Pain, and basically I read my way through most of Lewis's apologetics. And then I went on to Chesterton. This was still like, early high school. And when by the time I was 16, I decided I wanted to be baptized, which I had not been, and as a baby. And so I got baptized at the church that my grandfather went to, which was Riverside Cathedral, which is kind of interdenominational, fairly social gospel-y Protestant cathedral on 121st Street on the Upper West Side, which I want to say John D. Rockefeller built, because Rockefeller was a kind of like liberal Baptist, and he felt very competitive because the Episcopalians were building St. John the Divine.
Right.
And so he was like, okay, well, if the Episcopalians get a nice, gorgeous, big building on the Upper West Side, all of the other people, all the other Protestants should also get one. So he built Riverside, and it is now and was then a UCC church, so it's United Church of Christ, which is the kind of catch-all mainline-y. Mainline, if you're not any of the other kinds of mainline, is how I would describe it. We used to joke that it stood for Unitarians Considering Christ, which
That's a really good description.
it was
There are, I mean, so certainly I know. Well, and now living in Middleborough, Mass, there are a lot of variations. In the South, did not, when we heard UCC, we just thought, oh, the liberal of the liberal, But actually, it's fascinating how many varieties of UCC churches and pastors there are. So yes, I mean it spans so broadly, but yes, that makes a lot of sense, especially when what little I've observed from some. So
yeah, it was definitely the liberal of the liberal, Protestant, sort of generic Protestant churches, and I got baptized, although according to a formula that I was probably, I don't remember. So it was probably Creator, Christ, and Holy Ghost, which I brought up to my pastor, a couple of years ago, my ACNA, extremely Orthodox Anglican pastor, and also to a Catholic priest friend of mine, and they were both like, yeah, that doesn't count. we got to get you conditionally baptized. So I got conditionally baptized several years ago with the proper Trinitarian formula, but it was still, some kind of yes to Jesus, I think.
Yes, of course.
That first baptism, and I kind of skipped all my baptismal preparation classes, and I felt very awkward. It was such a weird thing to do in my, no one in my, school was getting baptized. I'm sure some of them had been baptized as babies, but it was, no one in my friend group was there were a lot of bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvahs, but it was just not something, a sort of teenage baptism was not something that I'd known anyone else to do. I didn't know anyone, and I didn't really know anyone other than my grandfather who went to church, and it was I was kind of embarrassed about it, but it was also something that I felt like I really wanted to do and needed to do and was kind of being called to do, and so I did it. And I was 16, so it was mid high school, and then I went on to Amherst, and there was an evangelical student group at Amherst. It was almost entirely Korean students for some reason. But there was also kind of an evangelical, there was a rabbi, there was a priest, there was an evangelical pastor. I'm not sure if there was a mainline pastor, just as kind of spiritual advisors to the students. But, there was this evangelical group on campus who were very, very alien to me. I just didn't hang out with them. I didn't know anyone who hung out with them. It was they used to come around and offer to vacuum our dorm rooms as a kind of act of service, and I always thought that was really weird and kind of creepy. And I'm trying to remember the guy's name who was the sort of evangelical pastor of the students, was called Paul something that started with an S. I can't remember. But I basically, I considered myself a Christian. I kept reading a ton of C.S. Lewis and a ton of, I read further, and obviously it was a liberal arts education, so we were reading Augustine and St. Thomas, I think, and just we were reading a very standard kind of great booksy series of texts, which were hugely Christian. But I didn't, and I went to the Congregationalist church occasionally, but it was very, I don't know, I didn't, I'm not sure what was going on, but then in graduate school, a friend of mine invited me to a Vineyard church, which is sort of charismatic evangelical, and it was Cambridge Vineyard, and I went with two other friends from Amherst. So, like, this was a friend from Amherst who was in, we were all in, like, everyone went to Boston to go to grad school. Like, everyone went to Boston and Cambridge. And so there were a lot of Amherst people there. And so there was this kind of group of us who started going to the Cambridge Vineyard. And it was the first time I'd kind of like run into people who didn't believe that Jesus was dead. I mean, other than, I guess, the Korean students at Amherst, but I didn't really ever talk to them. And, you know, God gave me the gift of faith. I don't know. Like,
right.
That happened. And I, you know, didn't really know, but there was some, it wasn't, I don't want to make it sound like that was the conversion and there hadn't been anything before. It was,
Sure,
it was
sure.
a continuation of whatever it had been before. But it was much more lively, and it was much more like, okay, now I'm going to pray. I can sense God like having opinions about me.
Yes.
I'm getting scared, but not in a bad way. Like there's a reality here that I'm not controlling. And, you know, I prayed a lot, and I started reading the Bible at the beginning, and I just read it all the way through, and then I started again. And I was doing this with these two other very good friends. And we were all like, we would just spend hours and hours and hours and hours talking about stuff and talking, you know, late into the night while we were all doing our graduate work. And eventually my friend Brent, who was at Harvard Divinity School, getting an MDiv, which he'd been planning to get ordained in the UCC, actually. And he was one of the ones that, you know, had gone to the Vineyard with me. And he started sort of believing a really Orthodox faith, which was kind of awkward for him, because he was trying to get an MDiv at Harvard, which was not as friendly to that. So that was weird. And eventually he got ordained, not in the UCC, but as a Vineyard pastor. And then we all went to try to plant a church in Northampton, Massachusetts, which was a challenge.
I can imagine.
And then I ended up, that kind of flopped, but I'm really glad that we did it. It was like a wonderful experience. And by that time, I mean, I always kind of knew that I love Vineyard. It gave me a lot. It gave me a real sense of the reality of the supernatural in the Christian life, of God as someone who answers prayer, of, you know, it was really formative and wonderful. However, it was incredibly theologically flaky, and, you know, and I could also tell, you know, this is all right. There's this other kind of Christianity. There's a Christianity that's like not kind of DIY, and it was very much not my style as well. Like, it was this very kind of like California casual, like, we're like, and they were all from California. Like, they'd come from California to Cambridge to plant this church, and they were like, you know, we're like making you comfortable with like the music of your generation, and like all of the people
Cringe.
that they were trying to minister to, and like we're wearing like casual clothes, and like all the people they were trying to minister to were like, you know, New England and kind of Northeastern people who felt really uncomfortable with like all of these casual clothes and like pop music.
Right.
It was very weird.
Right.
So I ended up, once I moved back to New York City, I ended up going to an ACNA church, just, you know, a conservative Anglican church. And I'm very happy there. Brent is now a Catholic. And yeah, it was just like, it was very much like, a lot of the things we were talking about was like, all right, what's missing from this vineyard tradition that we know exists in the Christian tradition, and why is it not there, and where is it? As well as like what's wonderful about this vineyard tradition. So I'm now a very happy Anglican. And yeah, that's the story.
That reminds me a little bit of when I was a senior in high school. I had a pretty debilitating illness for a time, and had been raised Southern Baptist. But it was around that time where I first discovered the charismatic movement, and I mean, I'd heard about it before, usually in hushed tones, but this was something that was actually, it was life-giving. There were elements of it that were life-giving to me that I hadn't heard before. And so I probably for a year or 2 years listened to a lot of, quietly listened to a lot of sermons and teaching, and read books, because for a time I couldn't do much of anything else. But it helped me learn things about God that I didn't know, or that I had not experienced, I'll say it like that, before. It was not merely reasoned understanding of God. It was something much deeper than that. So I can relate to being a part of something that it makes sense, but then also seeing there's a lot more to the Christian life than this very subjective activity that, I mean, and there's nothing wrong with that, but if that's the only thing you have, yes, you don't know when your emotions are just poor, or when the Spirit of God is convicting you of something. And so yes, I'm very much understanding what you're talking about there. So in my own background, being from the South, there's a view that many have in the South about the North, particularly New York City.
I'm aware of this view.
Yes. And one of the reasons I've wanted to talk to you for a while, because I know we've been talking about doing this podcast for probably, we first discussed it 2 years ago. So talk about Manhattan and life there, growing up on the Upper West Side. What is it that you love the most? I know you could talk a long time about this, but what are the things to kind of give some people who have never been or never enjoyed the city the way that you have? What are some of the best things about life there?
It's that's a really general question. I'm not sure. I mean, A, it's my home, so I feel about it the way that everyone feels about their home, if they love their home. B, it's a real community. Like, a lot of my best friends growing up were just at walkable distance. Like Alistair and I now are, we have like probably 10 couples within within a half mile or something, who are like part of our church, or just other, couple friends who are nearby. We run into people, in the bagel store. It's extremely friendly and kind of social, and it's very easy to socialize. And I think, I never grew up in the suburbs or anything. I think it would have been really hard, that period of time when between like age, I don't know, 11 and 16 before you get your driver's license, as I understand it, because I didn't get mine until I was 26.
Wow.
Because you didn't need to. Like, nobody got their driver's license. But that period of time when you're like between 11 and 16, it seems to me it would feel very claustrophobic if I had grown up in a non-walkable place. But like, starting from when I was like, initially allowed to go out to the corner store and get some milk or whatever, and then go to school by myself and come back. From 11 or 12 onwards, I just had the run of the city. And I could go where I wanted and go on adventures and explore and meet up with friends. And I didn't have to ask my parents for a ride somewhere. And it was very, it was very kind of like the whole city was a playground, and it felt wonderful. I loved it, and I still love it. It's other than maybe our little house in Connecticut, it's my favorite place in the world. And it's incredibly humane. It's like a really humane way to live. Like, even just down to like, it used to be that when I came back to New York for Christmas from, college or grad school or whatever, or for, some period of time that was like a week-long period of time, like the first 3 days, I just feel like really weird and low energy, and kind of not low energy, but like my body would hurt. And it was because when you're in New York, you just move a lot more. Like, you're taking 15,000 steps a day easily. You're not thinking about it. And that I also just really love. It's very, and I love the fact that everyone there's a feeling that's very intense that I don't really quite know how to describe. But everyone in New York, or almost everyone, has this sense of we're all doing a project together, which is really worthwhile, which is being a New Yorker. And there's this kind of real sense of camaraderie about that, even if you don't know someone. Like, there's a sense that like you're doing the same project, and it's a really cool project, and really kind of unusual, and we get to live here.
So a heightened sense of localism.
Yeah, it's a real, like, nobody, or very few people who live there want to be somewhere else. Like, it's local people who were born and raised there, you couldn't really imagine living anywhere else. And then there's this whole batch of people who deliberately came there because it was what they dreamed of doing. And so there's this real sense of like, every day that we get to live here is kind of triumphant.
Which is interesting, because in many ways that is what people who have a back to the land dream, that's what they think they will get when they do that. And I'm not saying that one is worse than the other, but it is interesting for people who have, because I will admit, I mean, this is something I used to think about years ago, was it would be great to have all of the farm stuff. But when you pull that back a little bit, what you start to see is you really want community with people. That is a certainly overused word. But to know your neighbors and to know the people who live nearby, which is one of the great things, having just moved to Middleborough. It's certainly not New York City. But where we did live before in North Alabama, you would have to drive potentially 30 to 40 minutes to see a lot of the people from the church that we attended. But here, most of the people at our church live within 5 minutes. Now, 5-minute drive, but still, there are some people who live further out. But just it's very different, and the small town mentality is closer to what you're talking about than where we used to live. So it's a great thing to enjoy knowing your neighbors. So, in your background, raised, you said your father was ethnically Jewish. How did that part of your background affect you growing up? You have a unique vantage point from which to view some of the discussions right now in conservative Christian political. Well, it's not just conservative Christians, but those are the people that I talk with more often and that I interact with. There is an ongoing looming specter of anti-Semitism, and that may not be the best way to say it, I'm not sure, but that exists. So how have you observed that, from growing up and then in your last few years? What is your perspective, and how is that? How do you view that with your background?
When I was growing up, it was kind of assumed, or it was very, the impression that I got was very much, especially, the specter is the Cossacks. So, the Christian soldiers of the Tsar who come in and, burn your village down or whatever. And also, the Nazis, and just this sense of threat from Christian people who are understood to be Christians. Although I'm not sure that the Nazis would have been understood to be Christian. I think I was raised to think of them more as pagans, which is, I think, more accurate. But there was this kind of sense of there was definitely a sense of evangelicals or conservative Christians or fundamentalists or whatever you wanted to call them, and it was kind of all one thing, and it was all very mysterious, and coded as Southern and coded as country rather than city. They're all secretly anti-Semitic, and they really all secretly, or maybe not so secretly, don't like us and don't think that we're real Americans and would, be happy to herd us all into camps. And so there was a real fear there. When I converted, but that didn't seem to be related to Christianity per se, because there was no fear of C.S. Lewis being anti-Semitic, or it was more of a kind of American evangelical thing. And Chesterton actually was anti-Semitic, and there wasn't a big freak out about him, although Cecil was worse. Right. Gilbert kind of got his head screwed on straight later on. And so there wasn't a fear of Christianity per se. It was a fear of American evangelical Christians. And then also, obviously, the various, it's just kind of people keep trying to kill us, and you kind of have to keep your eyes open. And when I converted, I was the first summer after I converted in grad school, the sort of grad school conversion, I was well, shoot, I'm a conservative Christian now. I better go bite the bullet. And so my friend Leanna, who is married to Brent, who is the guy who went to Harvard Divinity School, she had an uncle called Uncle Janus, who lived in Kentucky, and he was a Southern Baptist pastor, and he had a summer ministry program that, like, you know, mostly it was kids from Wheaton or whatever, like kids from, or, you know, young people from doing graduate work in Christian schools would go and do kind of like apprentice ministry with him. And so I went down to Kentucky, and I did like vacation Bible school, and I did clown ministry.
Wow.
And I was so scared. I was like, all right. I took you know, a jar of instant espresso because I wasn't sure they'd have coffee. Which in retrospect was like, what? Yeah, like, it was so, I'd never been to, you know, I grew up basically going, I had not been to the South.
Right.
And I'd also not been to the middle part of the country. I'd been to the Northeast and to California and to Europe a lot, but I had not been to the South, except for Florida. And
which is not truly the South, I guess, depending on what part you visited.
But the South is like a very scary place for New Yorkers. And I got there, and I was worried, like, are they going to be anti-Semitic? Like, is this vision that I have? And, you know, obviously I was changing, and like all of my assumptions were upended, and like I didn't know how the world worked. Like when you convert as an adult, having not grown up at all in a Christian culture, you're just like, well, everything I knew about how the world worked is pretty much wrong. Maybe like except for like some basic ethical teachings of like, you know, you ought to love your neighbor, and you ought to, you know, be kind, and you know, basic kind of 10 Commandment stuff, which obviously, unless everyone grows up, well, you know, presumably. I was brought up very morally. I was not, so that was not a change. But in terms of metaphysically, in terms of like what's real, and also in terms of like assumptions about sociological assumptions, like, you know, what people are like, everything gets kind of like thrown up into the, like, you're just like, well, I'm putting this all on the table because I don't know how it's all going to sort out. So you're really like giving up your worldview. I hate the word worldview. I do not approve of it. But you are like kind of putting your worldview on the altar.
Right.
And so I was like, all right, maybe these people are not going to be anti-Semitic. And as it turned out, they were incredibly not anti-Semitic. They were incredibly philo-Semitic. To a point that was a little bit weird, actually. But, you know, I did kind of like make a point to, on occasion, like mention that I was Jewish. And everyone was just like incredibly into it. Include like this one little girl who, you know, said, "You're Jewish. Do you wear a covering on your head like Rebecca?" Because she had a Bible stories book where Rebecca had a head covering. And I have, you know, basically starting from when I just like a straightforward person read through the Bible and got to Corinthians, I do cover my head when I pray. So I was like, yeah, I do. But it was, you know, in retrospect, like I now kind of understand more about the kind of dispensationalist stuff that was like in the background there. But the way I experienced it was just like, oh, these people aren't anti-Semitic at all. Like it's a little bit weird the way that they're not, but that's okay. And you know, and that was kind of like how I experienced Christianity from then on. The first time I ran into anti-Semitism among Christians was actually among traditionalist Catholics. So there's this guy, E. Michael Jones, who a couple of years ago, I think it was like in 2016 or so, 2017, 2018, I think it was later, it was 2018, he decided that me and my friend Leah Labresco, who's a Catholic convert from Judaism, and then our friend Simcha Fisher, and he thought that I was Catholic, which many people do. He thought that we constituted a new converso crisis. I mean, conversos are like, basically fake converts.
Right.
Who were thought to be, subversive. Yeah. And and the three of us were like, well, that's interesting. I really kind of wonder about, like, does he actually think that, like, there is a plot to get Jewish women to pretend to convert, and they have to give their lives to pretending to convert, and then, like, subvert the church from within or something. We decided that New Converso Crisis was a really good, like, prog rock band name. And we
Right. Yes. Excellent.
That was kind of the plan for what, and we wanted to, like, make merch and stuff.
Yes.
But anyway, so that was kind of the only real anti-Semitism that I'd run into in Christian circles until probably, like, about 2 years ago, when it started popping up in Protestant circles too, which was kind of surprising to me. It's sort of like a bunch of Protestants got, like, a new hobby or something. And I kind of know where, I sort of know where it comes from.
Right.
I mean, at least bits and pieces of it, but it's been very strange. It's been very disconcerting.
Well, there's a number of reasons, I'm sure, and I don't want to get bogged down in this, because it's something that I hope some good, strong teaching and a lot of prayer and the appropriate attitudes will in time the Spirit will correct. But I know growing up Baptist, there are a lot of men who grew up, at least in the South and other places, charismatic or Baptist, who were raised dispensational in their thinking. And as they study the Bible more, and many come to Reformed theology, and they see that, the way that I was taught is, well, it's faulty in several areas. So if that's the case, then I need to be open to thinking a different way about different topics, and because of the dispensational, let's say, appreciation of Israel, they think, well, this is something that obviously dispensationalism is not correct. So then this appreciation should not be given. And then once you start typing in a few statements here and there, you come across those who are not Christians, excuse me, who have all kinds of scapegoat techniques for blaming. I mean, they want to blame someone, and I know, Susannah, you already know all this stuff, but this is just, I know that there are men who think, I was raised this way, it's not right, so they swing and overcompensate hard in the other direction. And there are people, and sadly, someone like, you mentioned Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, even more so, and this is, and the fact, if someone starts reading a little bit about Central European conservatism, it's there in spades.
Well, I mean, it's there in the. It just to be. I'm not a dispensationalist, so like I never was. Like the theology, in as much as I first got theology, it was sort of Reformed Catholic, and so I didn't even really understand what it was that I don't fully now understand what it is that dispensationalists believe, to be honest. But so it's I understand that. And it was kind of like, there was something a little bit like uncanny, I would say, about the way that these very dispensationalist Baptists reacted to my being Jewish, which was, in retrospect, a lot better than anti-Semitism, but it was a little bit like manic pixie dream girlish. Like they were like, I was this otherworldly figure or something. And that's not good, but and obviously, I don't think you need to go to non-Christian sources to find anti-Semitism. I think, as soon as you start digging into like Reformed theology, there's plenty of it there.
Right.
So it's not like an exogenous thing. You just have to kind of like, there's plenty of a lot of stuff in every tradition. Then you have to kind of like figure out what in it is inherent to the tradition and what is kind of like, fleshly or sinful sort of importations onto it, or things that get kind of like latched onto it, that are kind of like, anti-Semitism seems to me to be one of these like, it's just like it's like malaria. It kind of just pops up every now and then, and you just have to kind of like, see it for what it is and not get confused.
Right. And in some cases, dwelling on it, at least from a pastoral perspective, dwelling on it is not always the best thing. You want to teach properly, but not focus on something so much that the large majority who are not even affected don't start to say, what is this he keeps talking about? So you don't want to go in that direction either. Now, switching gears a little bit, one of the interesting elements that you've talked about in the past and you've written about is something called post-liberalism. And I know this is a broad topic and probably deserves its own separate podcast. So, understanding that, tell us, what is the difference between, there's liberalism and then there's post-liberalism. You can take this wherever you would like, but just for the average person, the word post-liberalism doesn't have much meaning. So what is it, and why is it, for Susannah Roberts, why is it appealing?
Yeah, well, it doesn't really have much meaning as a word at all, to be honest, it's kind of a problem in that sense. All it means is not liberalism and after, or after liberalism. And the kind of liberalism that it's talking about, that it is after and that it kind of thinks that there are problems with, is the 18th century liberalism or 17th and 18th century of, Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau and Voltaire, and this kind of liberal tradition that and Kant, obviously all of whom disagreed with each other on a jillion levels, but there was a kind of common vision, to a certain degree at least, and it was a common rejection of an earlier tradition, which you might call kind of classical political philosophy, which had its own roots in Aristotle, although liberals would also sort of claim Aristotle as one of their forebears as well. But the biggest, at least the way that I mean it, and this is the thing, like, there's absolutely no way to know what any given person means by post-liberalism without talking to them. It's like totally impossible and a thankless task, which I did not realize like 2 years ago. And recent events have made it clear that like we need to be a little more specific in spelling out what, if you're not going to have liberalism, or if you're going to do something that is other than liberalism and is after it, what is that something? Because, fascism is not liberalism and is after it. Communism is not liberalism and is after it. Kropotkinite anarchism is, et cetera, et cetera. And none of those are what I'm talking about. The what I the attempt has been, and it's been kind of me and a bunch of other friends who are theologians and political philosophers focused on political theology, is to get back to a kind of the general, and there's a degree to which this is a stereotype of liberalism, and it can easily have holes poked in it, and probably should. And I think in the past I've been too doctrinaire in like not seeing the more complicated pre-liberal parts of, in particular, John Locke that are there. The main book, I guess, to understand the general post-liberal critique of liberalism is Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, which Obama, interestingly enough, had on his favorite books of 2018 list or something. But there's this whole kind of standardized critique of liberalism that pretty accurately says that it kind of starts with the assumption of the basic human person as a 30-something-year-old man who doesn't have any physical needs, who is an individual, who is a property owner, and all of society is downstream of this individual. So the way that society happens is, 30-something is kind of like a, whatever, that's a little bit of a joke, but an adult who is not too old to take care of him, who is not so old that he needs other people to take care of him. But the theory of how society, how politics happens, according to 18th century liberalism, is a bunch of these adult men get together and they have these rights, these individual rights to self-ownership and to ownership of property. And they compact together, they contract together to form a society, so the social contract, which will help them all pursue their individual projects more effectively, and which will protect them from, physical assault, because they'll establish a police force, which will have laws that they establish to protect, especially their ownership of property. And that's what society is. That I've just described is what society is. That is a very different picture from the earlier vision of, that's a very basic picture, but it's a very different picture than the earlier description of society, which comes from someone like Aristotle, where, his line is, man is by nature a political animal. So when you're born, even before you're born, you are dependent. When you're born, you are born as a social animal, like other social animals. You are not, humans are no more individual animals, non-social animals than, a pack of wolves are individual non-social animals. We come in packs, humans, and that's not true of all animals, but it is true of us. And what that looks like is that we're born into families and into communities that are sort of enlarged families. And as we grow up and as those communities get bigger, we find our thriving and our flourishing with each other, and in what are called common goods, and in particular, when kind of human societies have matured, in what are called political common goods. So a common good is basically something that you enjoy only while you're doing it with other people. So a private good would be a piece of cake, which you can go off and you can enjoy as a piece of cake by yourself in a corner. A common good would be a birthday party. So you can't enjoy the goodness of a birthday party if you're by yourself. All the things that we enjoy with each other, not just alongside each other, but that we need other people in order to enjoy, those are common goods. And political common goods are those particular kinds of experiences of living together politically that we enjoy with each other. So, for example, living in a just society with just laws, or living in a society where, we have freedom of speech so that we are able to talk with each other about, how we want to organize society, or living in a society where, this is all kind of downstream of justice. Justice is the basic first thing that you are looking at. So the vision of what humans are is kind of fundamentally different in this pre-liberal sort of vision of politics. Humans are social or political animals who are naturally cannot be happy, cannot survive without each other at any point, really. Like, there's like a couple of points in your life when you kind of think that you can be independent, and that feels really good. And there are goods that are associated with those, with the kind of liberal moment in each person's life, or the liberal period of time in each person's life, where like you are contracting, like you're doing projects that you thought up on your own, and or you're getting together with friends and you're like forming a company, and you're like, these are like, those are genuine goods. They're just not kind of the human basic state of being, and they're certainly not the only. They're kind of like they're special times. Like, the liberal times in our lives are special times.
Right.
And, they're associated with kind of more masculine, to a certain degree, approaches to things. They're associated with, like, I would say, a younger part of your life, when you're kind of like striking out on your own against, and defining yourself against your family, before you realize you actually have to define yourself in terms of your family also. And post-liberalism is basically an attempt to be like, okay, this liberal description of the world and the politics that flow from it, which are politics which are very focused on, politics that are focused on extremely minimal government, on the primary job of laws is to protect property rights. That politics is not really enough, and it ends up being a bit inhumane, and not providing the kind of support that the whole of human society needs, that every member of, a generation, or every member of like all the parts of the family need, or that the family needs as a family, as opposed to as a collection of individuals. And what we've been trying to do with post-liberalism is kind of have a politics that's based on that pre-liberal vision of what human beings are, social and political animals, and that doesn't ditch the goods that are associated with liberalism, because there are plenty of goods that are associated with liberalism.
Certainly.
And a lot of those goods are actually not liberal goods. They're goods that appeared in pre-liberal societies, or that, sometimes appeared slightly differently inflected in pre-liberal societies, but they are very much in the public mind associated with liberalism. So things like freedom of speech or freedom of conscience. The way that a post-liberal might talk about freedom of speech is, we have freedom of speech because other people have the duty to not unjustly shut us up. There are things that we can be shut up for justly, like, if you're slandering someone, or, certain kinds of like porn are not, you don't need to respect someone's freedom of speech to do those kinds of things. But what speech is, the sort of ideal vision of people deliberating rationally together about the good and about how they want to organize their lives, that's actually quite important, and that is a quite vital human thing. Oliver Donovan talks about the duty of candid speech as a kind of precursor to the right to free speech. Obviously, laws that don't respect persons, so i.e. laws that don't, give different punishments based on, like, if you kill someone, the Code of Hammurabi, like, if you kill someone, if you killed a nobleman, and you're not a nobleman, you're going to be in a lot more trouble than if you are a nobleman and you kill a non-nobleman. The Torah and kind of downstream from the Torah our laws don't do that. Like, murder is murder, and so there's not this kind of like respecter of persons aspect to law, and that is kind of assumed to be a liberal good. It's extremely not a liberal good. It's there in the Torah, or at least it's not a good that depends on 18th century liberalism.
Right.
Things like freedom of conscience, like the church fathers talked about the impossibility of compelling faith. Augustine disagreed, but he was, for his time, a minority position.
Right.
And, all of these things that, like, we think of as we need liberalism in order to have them, I think we need to not throw out the liberal order, because that is the order that we have been given, largely.
Right.
And you shouldn't throw out what you're given. You should steward it well. But I do think that actually the liberal order and the goods that we associate with that are even more strongly they don't really contain their own explanations. Like,
Right.
I don't think that there's a real good kind of logical, we ought to have liberalism in a strong sense that's contained within the liberal worldview. And so I actually think that the goods that we associate with liberalism can be more effectively kind of upheld by a pre-liberal vision of what human beings are, what justice is, what politics is and is for. And that is what I mean by post-liberalism. However, there are a whole bunch of other people who mean a whole bunch of other things by it, which I have begun to learn.
Well, that is again, it is a fascinating discussion. For me, the thing that made me first start led to my questioning the liberal narrative, having studied history, taught history for a while in various schools. Any view that says all of history has led to this particular philosophy being supreme right now, as the saying goes, it raises my hackles a little bit. It's concerning because that what you're saying is that God has ordained all things so that this view would reign supreme, and I don't see that anywhere. And when someone like Francis Fukuyama's his work about that we are, after the Cold War, at the end of history, in a sense. And I know there's more nuance than just the title of his book. I understand that, but it was a view that says that everything is led to this point in time is concerning, and it strikes as being not really a philosophy of life, but more an ideology that everyone should adopt. And if we can just get everyone to adopt this same ideology, it'll solve the world's problems. And that is, well, it's never happened before, for one thing. You can't make the world ask John Locke into their heart. It doesn't work.
We tried.
Yes.
We tried at various points.
Yes.
U.S. military force to encourage people to ask John Locke into their hearts.
Yeah, well, and that is the same view, though, that you mentioned Augustine saying that we could force, militarily, if necessary, people to convert. That and I think James Kurth actually, the geopolitical writer, wrote an article about this years ago about Woodrow Wilson and how the United States has, for now over 100 years since he was president, tried to, or has taken a secularized form of postmillennialism, and Kurt uses that. I don't know if you've read that or if you've read.
I haven't, but Walter Mead makes the same point. A lot of Walter Mead stuff is
right. So we're just taking what was a Christian perspective, removing the Christianity, but still trying to force the method on people, and that doesn't work in any form. So that's one reason I'm very partial to the post-liberal project, at least in certain respects. There are other respects in which, depending on who's talking about it, I guess. If someone is a hard Roman Catholic integralist, then I have other concerns.
as do I, although some of my best friends are hard Roman Catholic integralists.
I've told one friend who's close to that view, as long as you'll let me stay Protestant, I'm sure there are a lot worse things. So, in some ways, though, a lot of this, it's like when you're a little kid and you're playing in the sandbox with your friends outside. It is harmless to a point because it's probably not going to happen for. I'm always remember, and it fascinates me to this day, that R.J. Rushdoony, the American Protestant theonomist, wrote for
Triumph.
Yes, that's it. Triumph. Rushdoony wrote for Triumph magazine.
That's wild.
Now I don't know how consistent he was in writing, but I know that he wrote for them, and that thought blows my mind for a number of reasons. But it does to me show that there was some overlap in that theonomic project, as well as the integralism. Well, I don't know if you call Triumph.
Yeah, I'm not sure that you. Obviously, Bozell was doing a lot of what the contemporary integralists are doing, but I'm pretty sure the term integralism is fairly recent.
Right.
And for any readers or listeners, who want to check it out, the josias.com is probably the best integralist website out there, and it's not flaky. It's very carefully thought out. It's run by a good friend of mine called Potter Edmund Waldstein.
So I've read some of their work, and it's well reasoned. It is clear. So yes, I'll try to put that in the notes for this, because there are a number of ways that this can be implemented, and right now it's certainly in the discussion stage. At the same time, I believe it's obvious that things are changing in the way that the general populace views at least what passed recently for the liberal or neoliberal order. That no longer suffices for many. So hopefully people will make wise decisions, though, about what they're looking for as that order crumbles.
Yeah, I one of the things that I would... So there are a couple of things. One is that recently John Milbank and I and a couple of others wrote and then published a kind of post-liberal manifesto of sorts to attempt to define what Milbank and his project meant by post-liberalism as over against, and he was the kind of person to popularize that word, essentially. That was kind of his word. It's been recently taken up by very right-wing American groups that have, done a lot of different stuff with it, including, real sinister racial stuff and kind of various other kinds of there are a lot of things that are not liberalism that are bad. It's just, it's sort of like re-enchantment,
Yes,
like,
yes,
if you want re-enchantment, I get it, but like some re-enchantment is like really freaky and evil. So don't, be careful what you wish for, or be more specific about what you wish for, I guess. And so that manifesto is very helpful. I don't fully agree with it, although I did help write it. But it's very helpful. And also the person that I would kind of like point to as the best liberal post-liberalism, like liberal in a kind of like adjectival sense of like having liberality.
Yes.
And upholding these like the good of human freedom and the good of human agency and the dignity of each person, but without kind of like subscribing to the Lockean individualist kind of, you're not really allowed to be a baby or an old person version of liberalism, is Oliver O'Donovan. O'Donovan is wonderful, and he's just very careful. I've come to appreciate him more since I've kind of realized the, like, when you first get a hold of some of these ideas, you just kind of go nuts with them, and you just like, it's like a, carnival. Like you just have a lot of crazy fun with various kinds of crazy ideas. And then when you start sort of both seeing those ideas being potentially put into practice or also being taken in directions that you can see where if you weren't careful, you could take it in that direction, you just get more like, I'm not going back to being a Lockean or still less a Hobbesian at all. And although Kant was kind of my first philosophical love, I'm not a Kantian either. I'm still, an Augustinian Thomist. But you're just like, oh, there are shoals here. There are shoals that you do not want to wreck your ship on.
Right.
Or other people's ships. And there are reasons that, it's kind of Chesterton's fence of liberalism. And there are reasons that certain liberal ideas in the wake of the 30 Years' War got so popular. And if we're not, and that's why kind of like the importance of like not throwing out the heritage that we've been given, but of liberal institutions and even many liberal ideas, but kind of bolstering it with a more humane and a more classical and more Christian humanist underpinnings, I guess. That's what I would describe the project as at the moment.
It seems that the course of wisdom is often to navigate between those shoals that would wreck the ship. So learning to steer wisely, to know where the ship is most likely to crash, give the greatest attention to that direction, but also don't overcompensate and slam yourself into the other side.
And so much of this is really downstream of like, the other thing to think about is like, it's not just people having fun with ideas or being driven by dark forces to grab hold of bad ideas. It's also like people at various points in their lives running into different bits of truth and grabbing onto that, and maybe grabbing onto it in a disproportionate way. So for example, I was raised very much like you need to choose your career. Like that is you need to like basically define yourself. You have to make yourself, and like what are you going to be? What are you going to contribute to the world? Like that is hugely important. And I don't disagree with that. But it was kind of it felt unbalanced. And then when you sort of run into this vision of what it is to be an adult, where it's like, all right, what are my obligations? And how can I try and like work to practice these virtues to make myself into a person who is a good person and has has these human excellencies to the greatest degree possible, and how can I and what are my obligations to my family and to my community and to what I've been given, and to that is such a refreshing kind of it humanizes the quest to get the right livelihood and the right what you are when you've grown up, in a way that I think was really important to me and is really important to a lot of people. But then so that's kind of like a more communitarian and a more virtue ethicist approach to being an adult. But obviously that can go overboard, and you can if you were starting from a very, very hyper communitarian world where what you like to do and what your ambitions were totally didn't matter, and you were just meant to fulfill this one role, especially for women, the kind of sense of there is one thing that you should do. But I actually think it happens for men too, especially in Christian communities where anything other than spreading the gospel is devalued. Mm-hmm. So it's you might you might want to write screenplays, or you might be interested in metallurgy or sailing, but the only thing that really matters is evangelism.
Right.
And I know enough guys who've kind of grown up in circumstances like that it feels really claustrophobic.
Right.
And so that's maybe a little too communitarian, and I wouldn't call it virtue ethicist, but it's all right, no, you can actually be curious and interested in the world and decide for yourself what it is that you want to pursue, and God can be in that as well. I actually think that for guys who are struggling to understand what it is that at least some women experience as kind of oppressive in, I have not experienced this because, again, it's not really my world, but talking to women friends of mine who've grown up in evangelical worlds where there is one thing that you're supposed to do, which is be a wife and a mother. I think that feeling can be a little bit like what it's like for guys who grow up in there is one thing that you're supposed to do, and that's reach people for Christ.
Right.
I think that there's a parallel there that could maybe help people understand what the sense of crampedness might be.
And the part of the beauty of the Protestant Reformation is that they were attempting to restore the beauty of all the vocations.
Yeah. Luther was particularly good on this.
Yes, he was. In fact, when I used to teach economics to homeschoolers, and I would bring in some reading of Luther's Doctrine of Vocation as just one of the things that is. This is not borrowing from Peter Berger, but there is a reason why Protestants were successful in a lot of business ventures, and I know that can be taken to the extreme as the other things we talked about. But I'm sorry, that's not Berger, it's Weber. Thank you. But they believed that there was a calling to every vocation, and that you could do those things, whatever it is, and men and women both, to the glory of God, and that has positive implications.
I actually think that thinking in Lutheran terms about vocations to marriage and parenthood is a helpful way of kind of balancing, understanding or getting around some of the objections that, again, I've never experienced this. I've I've rarely experienced sexism, except like random people online. But, Luther did have this real strong sense of like, okay, there's a primary kind of vocation, which is either calling to monasticism or calling to being a parent and spouse. And his kind of like the first thing that he did was, and I'm a little bit iffy about various things that he did with regard to this, but like he basically said the calling to being a parent and spouse is also noble. And, I am not a Lutheran. I would say that technically the calling to singleness is probably higher, which St. Paul seems to have agreed with. But the calling to being a parent and spouse is a noble thing that most people are called to. And then within that, obviously, the different kinds of métiers that different households do together, and the valuable ways that like you as a household kind of create a household economy and contribute to the creation mandate, like that starts to feel a little bit, and obviously men and women do that differently, and women are much more involved in the nurture and rearing of children, especially in the younger years. But like it's not like women are called to be wives and mothers. Men are called to be like, stockbrokers. Like that's
Right,
not
right.
really the parallel there. Men are called to be husbands and fathers, most of them, and they should do that because that's God's call on their lives.
Yes. Susannah, I believe we could go on for a while, and I really appreciate the time you've taken to talk. It's been fun, and we've covered a lot of subjects. So I hope we can do this again at some point in the not too distant future, because I know you have a lot of other topics that you've thought about and written about. So thank you again for the time you've taken. It's been a delight.
Well, likewise, and thank you so much for asking me and nagging me about it a bit.
Certainly. I'm glad to do that whenever I can.